All right, so thank you everyone for coming. Sorry, it's just taken a while because I have a PowerPoint, so we had to rearrange all the filming equipment. Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that intervention. So the first announcement for anybody who was expecting Sandy Steingard, very, very unfortunately she couldn't come. She ended up having kind of a last minute conflict with a training that she's in. I'll have sort of tried to incorporate a couple of her ideas into this presentation. She was going to talk a bit more about her efforts in a preliminary way to integrate some open dialogue principles into her work in Vermont, where she runs a psychiatric center and has in the past been involved in the RAISE first episode study that the NIMH funded in various different states here. So we're starting late, so I guess that's a good thing, because I wasn't planning to take up the entire hour, since, you know, Sandy was going to be a big part of it originally. So the title of my presentation is Self-Determination and Cultural Complications, Exploring a Model U.S. Early Intervention for Psychosis Program. To say a little bit about myself and how I got interested in this area, when I was first diagnosed with psychosis, schizophrenia, I was in an early intervention program in Chicago. So that was kind of my initial experience, actually, of the mental health psychiatric system, and has sparked kind of a lifelong interest in early intervention and first episode psychosis. I'll now move on to the description of my project. So in this presentation, I'm going to be using quotes and, you know, and information from ethnographic observation from a user-led qualitative project at an early intervention for psychosis program in Oregon, which is statewide and multi-site. At this point, the sites vary in terms of what they do. It has involved a lot of ethnographic participant observation, so I regularly attend multifamily groups, the peer groups, the recreation groups, clinical meetings, etc., to really get a better feeling for how the program operates at multiple levels. And then in-depth qualitative interviews with clients, program alumni, parents and significant others, as well as the frontline clinicians who are actually running the program. I should say that everybody involved in the design and implementation of the research project, not just myself, are service users or survivors with lived experience of psychosis. And so a lot of that has sort of infused the questions that we were interested in asking, the way that we go about it. We've tried to be as participatory as possible in terms of actually getting the clients of this first episode program directly involved, which we've had mixed success with. We can talk more about that later. We're currently working on collecting data from a comparison sample in Chicago at a community-based transition-aged youth early intervention program that doesn't have a psychosis-specific focus but includes many people who are experiencing psychosis. For anyone not familiar with the whole sort of TAE setup in the U.S., this is basically young adults, youth who have gone through the foster care system and are being transitioned out of the supports provided through foster care and through, Medicaid and other aspects of that. Describing the program that I've been working with, so they have a focus, at least in theory, on ultra-low dose medications, not always antipsychotics. So they use antidepressants fairly frequently, anxiolytics, sometimes, completely in place of antipsychotics. 20% of their population, as a rough estimate, is not taking any medications. And that's not taking any medications, meaning not non-adherent, quote unquote, but they're not prescribed anything. The time frame is 2 years for most of the sites, but they're flexible with that, or at least most or some of the sites are flexible. And so they'll allow people who are experiencing continuing problems beyond the initial 2 years to keep attending at least certain aspects of the program. The services they provide are pharmacotherapy, individual therapy, family therapy, multifamily groups. Multifamily groups, if people don't sort of have any background or history on them, include the client as well as the family, as well as any significant others or friends who are interested in attending from multiple different families. So everybody's there. It's typically facilitated, at least in Oregon, by a couple clinicians, usually social workers, clinical social workers. And it's very oriented towards that each session, one family will end up being focused on, and they will pick a problem that they're struggling with, and everybody will provide support and brainstorm about ways that as a family unit they could work to address that problem. In some of the sites, they have peer groups that can include recreation and like music or cooking. One site has their own band that the youth are involved in. Some sites provide like meditation classes and regular acupuncture. There are physical wellness nurses pretty regularly, and there's mandatory metabolic monitoring. So they are very concerned about side effects of antipsychotics, and pretty much say you don't have a choice. We're going to be monitoring your weight and cholesterol, lipids, and so on, and are then very proactive about trying to figure out ways to address those side effects right away if people are starting to show signs of riskier metabolic syndrome or something. It's a team-based model. The focus is on maintaining or increasing the client's community integration, preventing enrollment in SSI, SSDI, or Medicaid. This is a huge goal. They want to keep people out of the disability system. They never want them to get there. They don't want the negative identity impacts that can come along with that. So it's one of their major goals. Avoiding engulfment in a patient identity. So there's no, and again, this can probably varies a lot by site, but the ideal is that there's no use of diagnostic labels, that they're not really labeling people, that they're focusing very strongly on recovery and treating psychosis as something that potentially could just be transient or temporary and very well may disappear. So they don't want people to think of it as sort of a core part of their identity and that they're a passive patient within the system. The funding right now is grant and state-based, and it's not dependent on any type of insurance or Medicaid status. So the young adults who qualify and their families can receive all of these services completely for free, even if they have no insurance company to bill for it. And the overall philosophy is a focus on self-determination and support for clients' own explanatory models. Again, as we know, these things don't always play out in reality the way they play out in theory, but theoretically, if somebody comes in with a spiritual model, a trauma-based model, the clinicians will just roll with that. So as a kind of overarching theme, and because this is a project that's in process, this isn't like sort of final rigorous coding or analysis. These are sort of developing themes. And so my question is, individualized engagement is everything, because individualized engagement comes up again and again when you're talking to family members, when you're talking to clinicians, when you're talking to clients. So nearly everybody says, well, if they're engaged, they end up doing well. But then what does engagement mean? How does it vary for particular individuals? And for those young adults who are disengaged, what do you do? So some observations that I thought, have been really interesting is that some of the young adults work best with what was described to me as like a cool older brother figure, and some prefer a mom or grandma. As it's been put to me. So because there's a team and there's a lot of people involved in each of these programs, the young adults are going to maybe gravitate towards different figures regardless of their role. So they might be a wellness nurse, they might be one of the clinical social workers, they might actually be one of the prescribers. Some of them want groups, peer engagement, family work. Some want total autonomy and engagement primarily outside the program. For instance, I talked to a couple of clients who have a completely outside religious spiritual mentor, don't want that to enter into their interactions with the program, and that's their preference. Even the best-intentioned parental involvement can play out in all kinds of ways. So, these are very young adults, the age that the program serves, and again, there's a little variance across sites, is 12 in some cases, 15 in others, up to 25, and I think it goes a little older for some of the programs. So basically, you're dealing with a large percentage of people who are still living at home or very closely involved with their family. And then poverty, English as a second language, racial ethnic misunderstanding and distrust, foster care involvement, alternative family arrangements such as, youth who are not living with their parents, who are living with a family friend or a grandparent. These do really sort of complicate this picture in terms of what it means for those individuals to be involved or not involved. So now I just picked two areas for the purpose of this presentation, given the theme of the conference to focus on. One of them being attitudes towards medications, and the other issues around language and identity. So what I wanted to emphasize here is the complex social, cultural, and familial influences on medication attitudes. So, my overarching point being it's actually not just about the individual, but the individual in this context in which they're getting all kinds of different messages from their family, from friends, from their school community, the larger community, society, and cultures and subcultures, which includes, anti-psychiatry, the consumer survivor movement, public media that recently, as people have probably seen, has been actually very critical of conflicts of interest between researchers and the pharmaceutical industry, et cetera. And my second point is that self-determination is often really hard to find because these young adults are being influenced in so many different ways from so many different angles that really figuring out what do they want is very difficult. So I have some longer quotes, and Oryx was complaining to me earlier today about people who have slides with that are completely covered in words, and I understand it's not ideal, and at the same time I do it when I'm doing qualitative presentations because I really want the participants' own words to come out. So here was a prescriber. I try to, in terms of the whole model, it's kind of like people can pick and choose which services or which areas they care to focus or have support in. Then there's sometimes if people are unraveling a bit, just trying to mitigate negative consequences without medications, if that's sort of how their process is going. Even though parents might be screaming in our ear, why don't you do something? Why don't you make them take medications? Which is hard because the parents and families are part of it too. I struggle with that sometimes. So here we're seeing how, how prescribers are also under these pressures, competing pressures that they often find really difficult to navigate and negotiate. So it's not just, the evil psychiatrist, but they're really struggling. Well, these parents are desperate, and on the other hand, I want to recognize the client's autonomy, and I don't really quite know what to do. And so sometimes even when you have a very progressive clinician or prescriber, the family is exerting a huge influence. Then, as an example of anti-psychiatry having made its way into popular culture, here's a client who said, when I was living in California, this was way back in middle school, and I was really depressed. There was a group of friends that I had in middle school who were Scientologists. They told me that psychiatrists were really bad people and that I should really stay away from them. This is one of the reasons why I didn't get help for my depression until much later. I was in high school. Even then, I wouldn't take medication. I didn't take medication until I was in college because I was told medications, they ruin your brain. They destroy your brain. That was told to me. They gave me pamphlets. It's like psychiatry is a horrible thing. And then his reflections now, I've definitely been exposed to some of that. I can see how psychiatry could be easily abused. You do put a lot of trust in a psychiatrist with your personal information, your personal life. It's very subjective. There's a lot of ways to abuse it, but my experience has been mostly positive. Medications have been very helpful. So again, even thinking about a more critical attitude towards psychiatry can come from a sort of culturally, in a sense, coercive force, or it's not necessarily about the type of sort of extended self-reflection that, that one would maybe hope for. So, and then next example of more of kind of the negative side of biomedicalization in clinical culture. This was a parent who were talking about their experiences prior to involvement in the program. We thought we were doing the right thing by taking our kids to the emergency room, and then all of a sudden we found ourselves in this horrible place where people were pessimistic and, if not fatalistic, and weren't really helping, and were doing questionable things and pumping our kids full of medications that we just didn't feel like, I don't know, we expected something else. So they're running into this kind of this purely biomedical, let's medicate it away approach, broken brain. And so again, what I want to get at, these are just 3 examples, and there's, obviously many, many more I could have chosen, but what I want to show is how complicated it is. Then in the second section, I want to go into attitudes towards medications that are more centered around individual priorities, values, and identity. So here was a client who was only, only 18, and I think had started in the program when he was 17, a few months earlier. When nothing spiritual worked, I realized that I had to tell someone. When I told someone and all my symptoms fit with psychosis, it felt like it was a big relief. So like, woo, I'm crazy. And so I said, okay, going back to what you said earlier, he talked about this a bit earlier, does that mean that you think that medications are probably the most important part of treatment? Yes, medications. I don't think therapy can really help with psychosis because you really don't, unless it's brought on by PTSD or something, there's really nothing you can do except medicate it. Another client said that mania is both a gift and curse, so he had, psychotic mania. And then he talked at length about wanting to taper off his medications in order to return to or reclaim these spiritual highs. Now, both these youth were the same age, equally kind of uneducated. I mean, neither of them had had a chance to go to college yet and had already been having a difficult time in high school. Very different ways of understanding the relationship between themselves and their experiences and medication. And so it was more about sort of a fit with, at that time, at that point in time, their personal understanding and explanation of kind of causality and meaning. Another couple of examples, this was a clinician who said medications are often only the smallest part of recovery, so emphasizing kind of a really more minimal role. And then a parent who gave an anecdote about her son. So he refused to take any medication, but finally the emergency room doctors were able to convince him. He saw that as being a real concession on his part. I mean, like actually a life-changing concession when he first agreed to take the medication. That was sort of like the line that got crossed, that he betrayed himself. He still actually harkens back to that being in the emergency room and finally saying, okay, I'll take what you want me to take, and then feeling that everything kind of went downhill from there. So I was like, that he lost control then, yes. And she went on to explain that basically it was almost like this pivotal moment that just broke him, that just like broke his spirit, and that he never really recovered from. So there can be that loss of agency, or there can be a sense of greater agency, all from the same thing, all from the same, intervention. And then next, I wanted to get a little into sort of label avoidance as autonomy supportive or not. I think this is a really interesting issue. Some of the conflicting reactions to the program's decision to, by and large, not really use or rely on diagnostic labels, and in some cases to sort of like actively even refuse to use them or refuse to acknowledge them when a client chose to use them. And language and identification have really important implications with respect to self-esteem, identity, and development. And I think that's clear, both political aspects of identity, how well clients integrate their experiences into who they are. And it can go, I think, very different ways. And I think the comparison with the autistic self-advocacy and broader disability community and literature is really interesting, where you see both some groups that strongly emphasize person-first language, that would be person with a disability, others who emphasize diagnosis or disability-first language. So again, the autistic community is probably the best example. They strongly prefer being referred to as autistics. They do not have a contentious relationship with the way that the DSM defines what autism is. They've more embraced it, and at the same time are very radical politically, in the United States and kind of behind the neurodiversity movement here. And one of their claims is that, they really see their disability or autism as a core part of their identity, and why would they want to push it off and make it seem more peripheral? At the same time, other disability groups that really want to resist the negative cultural connotations of diagnostic or disability labels. So what I really want to say here is, at least when you look at this broader disability community, you see how it can in fact go either way and still be very political and radical and perceived as empowering by the individuals who are making those choices. And then there are complications of madness at the same time, or psychosis, that don't necessarily fit with many disabilities. So the fact that course is so heterogeneous, that the permanence of it is questionable, that identity can be about the phenomenological experience of symptoms or about service use and abuse within the psychiatric system. So it's not clear how that plays out in terms of identity, and when you have youth and young adults who are developing their identity in the most general sense, I think these are really critical issues to think more about. So here are now going to be a couple long quote examples of how this can play out in different ways. So a parent said that ISA people were not nearly as dire as the other providers. They were matter-of-fact, but in a completely different way than the acute or inpatient people had been matter-of-fact. The acute people were matter-of-fact in the way of, we see a lot of crazy people. We know how the crazy people scenario goes. You have a crazy person. This is how it's going to happen for the crazy person. We see a lot of it. The ISA people were, you know what, this isn't the end of the world. Kids, it turns out that a lot of kids have psychotic episodes and recover completely from them. So there the emphasis is really that this does not need to be a core part of, of the client's, of the young adult's identity, that it's something that we could just see as a temporary stage they're passing through. And the parent, at least in this case, felt that that was a really positive thing. Another example, this was a client who said, I think when I first joined the program, they were pretty adamant that it was psychotic disorder, not otherwise specified. Even after I got the diagnosis of schizophrenia from the mental hospital, they still didn't want to call it that, like it was almost a dirty word. They didn't even want to speak it. No, you don't really have that. It made it seem contrived. I do have these symptoms. I can diagnose myself because I can read the DSM. I meet the criteria for it. They're like, oh no, you don't meet the criteria. It's like they were in this denial state and that wasn't helpful. And this is a actually a really smart kid who wants to go to medical school, and he's pre-med. So his perception was that his own autonomy and self-determination were actually being limited, that he wanted to identify with a schizophrenia label. He thought that was accurate, and he thought they were being maybe patronizing, disingenuous, didn't want to admit to what was wrong with him. He also went on when I was talking to him about how he didn't feel like these experiences were just going to go away, and he didn't like the constant suggestion, which he almost felt was a minimization of who he was, that they would just go away. And then here's another different example. This is a different client. When I met with the nurse practitioner, she did say some people use the diagnosis label as part of their identity. To me, I think I've heard of that more for bipolar disorder. People with bipolar disorder say, I'm bipolar, as a way to differentiate themselves. With schizophrenia, I don't think it makes as much sense because there's not much good that comes out of it. People who are bipolar have euphoric states where they feel really brilliant and they can do lots of cool stuff that they can't do when they're not high. There's nothing good about schizophrenia, and he kind of laughed. It's hard to say I identify with the schizophrenia movement or anything like that. I don't really, and that's that. So again, I'm, really just trying to get at the, the multiple heterogeneous ways in which people are negotiating the same issue in the same clinical context. So this is my last slide, so leave some time for discussion. So to me, the key questions at this point as I continue to work on these projects is the role and value of self-determination and autonomy. What is it really when people are completely immersed and submerged in these complicated cultural and subcultural contexts, figuring out what is them in that, what do they want? And then how do we promote and nurture it if self-determination really is the goal? What does that look like? There's so many subtle ways in which you can be sort of coercive in pushing an ideological agenda, how to stay away from that. Negotiating complex cultural and social influences. So like probably many people in the room, I agree that there's a huge, enormous problem of sort of over-medication, non-evidence-based polypharmacy, non-evidence-based, high dosing of antipsychotics. But it's not as simple as just blaming big pharma or mainstream psychiatry, because there's many, many other things at play, including the desperation of parents, including just, attitudes towards medications and, sort of the mind-brain split within popular culture. And then this was a point that Sandy was going to make in her presentation, but what she calls monologic versus dialogic solutions and where you locate the problem. So are you locating the problem in the individual, and that's really the primary site of intervention? Do you locate it in the family and the network, more like an open dialogue approach does? Do you think even bigger and try to affect societal or cultural change? And if that is the issue, then how do we think about early intervention in a way that's not just the early intervention of the individual, but sort of early intervention in larger, broader cultural and societal terms. So, okay, so that's it for my slides. I hope we can have a good discussion.
Is this taking place, did you say this is taking place in Oregon?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but are you in Oregon, or?
No, I'm from Oregon. All my family lives in Oregon. It still hasn't made it as easy as it could be, but I can just stay with my dad for long periods of time. I wish I lived in Oregon. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for your presentations. Very, very interesting. I thought one thing that really fascinated me was a comparison between the individuals diagnosed with psychotic disorders and individuals diagnosed with autism, and how somehow the label of autism stuck for those individuals a little bit more, at least generally. And I certainly, kind of based on my own experience, the bipolar label also seems to stick for people a little bit more and to be kind of a point of pride. And it seems as though disorders that have been explained through biological processes in a more mainstream kind of way. I'm thinking substance use through NA and AA, where they have a highly kind of disease-driven model. Bipolar disorder, which is usually explained kind of chemically. It seems as though somehow that quells the tension that still exists within the so-called psychotic disorders, where there's still a fight between the psychiatric and the psychological explanation. Very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely fascinating issue. I always want to, it's like a back burner project, but to do some kind of like comparative, more ethnographic study of the autistic community and, you know, maybe people with a psychosis label within the consumer survivor movement. It's also really interesting how, you know, I mean, so neurodiversity is the term that's been taken up by autistics, and they're not, they don't have any problem with like neuroscience research. What they do is in fact very radical in terms of their organizing and the change they want to see and the services they want to see. But that piece of it, neuroscience is not the enemy to them. And that's really interesting too culturally. Why did that happen? Where I think there's a lot of distrust of research in the user survivor community. There's a lot of distrust specifically of any type of neurobiological model of experience. Mental diversity, as Oryx used, is kind of the farthest people would go. They're not going to embrace the term neurodiversity. Yeah.
I feel kind of like, because I've done a lot of work in this area too, and I feel like it's the people who get anything other than either borderline or schizophrenia that then want to cling to their label, whether it be OCD, bipolar, DID, anything that says I'm not schizophrenic or borderline. And then they're really happy with their diagnosis and they get very defensive about it because they're not that. As opposed to it being like they actually are proud of what they have. It's just more this defensive kind of stance. But then they become more that diagnosis in some ways too.
Yeah, and there's some quotes that I could have put up where, like, because, I mean, so people within these programs have different experiences. They'll often maybe end up in the hospital. So even if they're not getting diagnosed within the program, they get diagnoses. And a lot of people who said, you know, as soon as they were told it was bipolar, not schizophrenia, they were like thrilled. So.
I mean, I think I agree with what you just said, but I think you can also simply look at it from societal perspectives and societal attitudes. And all of those, you know, bipolar, autism, DID to some extent, they all have upsides to them. I mean, people see bipolar as being potentially very creative, very powerful, and certainly the general perception of autism is that they can be very intelligent in maybe a very narrow way. So there are clear upsides to it, but as your client said, you know, there's no perceived upside to schizophrenia or borderline for that matter. So it's kind of hard to identify with it, to pull out something positive from it.
And I mean, to go back to some of the things that in the last Hearing Voices panel that I was part of, that some people were here for, you know, I mean, that's not universally true when you look at other cultures, that, you know, certain aspects of psychotic experience have been valued and developed more. Tanya Lerman, who's an anthropologist at Stanford, is doing all this interesting work comparing voice hearing in Ghana, India, and the US, and although I think it's very preliminary in the sense that you really can't generalize from like small samples of people, that in a much more, you know, not a universal way, but just, you know, just as a sort of a general theme, voices tend to have much more positive content in India and Ghana. They're funny, they joke around, and it's not that people of course have positive experiences in the US as well, but the point being is that if the cultural sort of framework and context in which that's experienced treats it and values in a different way, it may fundamentally change the valence of the experience, the content, maybe even the structure. So.
Okay, so all this is working around my head. I've had a personal lived experience of being diagnosed with bipolar. I mostly identify, you know, in terms of my recovery, I would say like who helped me the most would be David Oakes and Mind Freedom International. because of my identification with people who have been forcibly drugged in a way that is very unhelpful, like traumatic, very unhelpful. So, I mean, one thing that sticks out to me, like with the autism people, being fine with neurological research into their disorder. One thing that I know, that I really identify with in the Mind Freedom International community, which espouses choice for drugs, would be that, all that research has never turned up this chemical imbalance that the drugs are supposed to be treating, So, like I think David Oakes even, he at one point he was fasting outside of the APA because he wanted them to say, what definitive research do you have that there is, that you have found a biochemical explanation for this disorder that you're saying, people, need these drugs for. And, my experience has been that like Robert Whitaker talks about in his books, that the medications cause chemical imbalance. They don't address chemical imbalance. So that, that's just, where that's been my experience and why, I kind of identify with that crowd that.
Well, and I certainly think that it's really important. I mean, that's certainly an important piece of the sort of the politics and the political reaction within the survivor movement, the consumer survivor movement. What's interesting to me, though, is that there's equally sort of tenuous, ambiguous evidence about, about many other disorders, including, bipolar disorder, autism, and also actually including chronic fatigue syndrome is like one of my favorite examples, where there are no known biomarkers, there's no known biological signature, and yet you have a patient community that sometimes in really militant ways, apparently in the UK there have been death threats of researchers who are arguing that it maybe has psychological, psychiatric, depressive, psychological aspects, and who want to say it is absolutely biological, nothing about it is psychological. So I guess my point would still be is that when the evidence, the biological evidence is contested across disorders, it still plays out differently, which is so interesting to me.
I mean, thank you very much for your talk, and I really value it because it felt really on the ground and grounded in clinical realities, and really I think you transmitted the complexity of what it's like to be a patient and a clinician in the services, and the crucial thing is that everybody is a bit different. Every family is a bit different when you work in a psychosis service, and so. And that's, what you really got across, that's the way it is. So how can we organize services in a way that addresses that complexity, in a way that has, and that's what I'm such a fan of what's called the need-adapted approach, because all the staff are familiar with all these different perspectives. If one person's going to want something, and actually you've got people with a range of different skills and service, so you can, I think we get hooked up a bit on one approach suits all, whether it's hearing voices or medication or family approach, whatever, but we need this range of different, and it's an attitudinal thing as much as anything else, isn't it? We can prepare to accept, look, every person comes in, we don't know quite what's going to be useful to them, and have the time and flexibility to, it's not impossible. Changing systems and
I guess, Ron, you haven't asked anything here yet.
Well, one thing I think is interesting is complex enough when we're trying to figure out what works for different people, but then I think an additional factor on top of that is that some things will work right away, but actually make things worse in the long run, and that can be especially tricky to sort out for people, because, we want to say, oh, you think it's working, oh, that's great, when sometimes you're going like, oh, I think this is going to lead to trouble, and that can be whether it's a behavioral strategy, a way of thinking about things, medication use, or whatever. It's just an extra layer of complexity.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's true for family members as too, who are even less prepared than clinicians because they don't have the experience of, working with multiple people, and they're trying to guess in an often really desperate way what is going to help my kid. My kid they never acted like this before. I see their whole future vanishing. They're desperate. They're panicking. And in a way, they have to make decisions that they just don't know the long-term consequences of. And that's an incredible, sort of ethical and psychological burden. And yeah, there's no... researchers, we try to figure it out, I guess, to make people's decisions easier, but when you're at a point where you don't know for sure, for any given individual, what's going to work, it's very, very difficult and very scary. Yeah.
I think the question of attitudes is a very, very important one, and it pains me as a proponent of psychoanalytic theory to say this, and I know that contemporary psychoanalysts have changed this, but the fact that psychoanalytic theory was originated from a place of treating individuals labeled as either a borderline personality organization or psychotic personality organization as untreatable seems to somehow still carry through, even though psychoanalytic theory is by and large not such a popular way of approaching psychology anymore.
It seems like the whole issue of self-determination and how all of the other systems impact on it, it's just so complicated that if each part of the system honored self-determination and said, this is really your life, we might get closer to it, but as a society, we don't honor self-determination.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because some people in their psychotic state are so self-determined and they get into such they're so certain that they're right and the rest of the world is wrong and that the police are so it's another complicated issue. Of course, self-determination in a non-psychotic way is absolutely what we're. But when people are in a psychotic state, when the psychotic state is leading them down a very dangerous path, for example, we have to be careful what we mean by self-determination. What state is determining what? Is it the non-psychotic part of the patient or the psychotic part of the patient is pushing, leading away?
Yeah, I think that whole issue, even for clients themselves, so I certainly have friends who are actually feel like at certain points being forced to do things in a certain way allowed them to return to their true self. So they actually appreciate more heavy-handed intervention because they feel like I was out of control, I had lost insight, and really appreciate that. So again, it's really difficult even in terms of the individual. Who are they? Who is their core self? And what is them doing things that they don't even want to think of as that was really me. That wasn't me. That's the kind of thing that you hear, or that wasn't me. So yeah, I'm grateful that somebody pulled me out of it. Other people are not. Other people in those same situations will end up experiencing such traumatic coercive treatment that it affects them for the rest of their lives. So And
also, if you look at the segment of folks who have experienced trauma, sometimes their embrace of being controlled and managed is just reenacting the trauma experience that hasn't been processed. So, and sometimes the abuse of the system just
feels familiar.
It feels familiar and can keep them in a traumatized, unprocessed way for a long time.
Mm-hmm. So I guess technically we're
I always have a problem with this one. When you tell them that you were diagnosed with schizophrenia, does that really help pierce through the negative aspects of the label and stuff, or just relax and... Not automatically,
no. And I have over time taken to, there's all these different theories of qualitative interviewing and how to maintain distance, and over time I disclose more rather than less. Because it's not enough to just say, I was in a first episode program, I've been diagnosed with schizophrenia, I've been on 20 different antipsychotics. Like, that's not enough. And in some of these cases, with even the clients who I quoted here, the best conversations were after these interviews, because they would ask me more like, the kid, for example, who had these like positive manic experiences and wanted to get off drugs, like finally by the end of the interview, the tape recorder was pulled off. Then he's like, so have you ever stopped taking antipsychotics? And he was actually like really interested, and then we ended up having a conversation, which of course I can't use for research, can't use for anything, that told me so much more about who he was than what was in the interview, because it was he felt like, okay, yeah, you get it, you understand, you've struggled with similar things. So to me, it's like, in terms of interviewing, it's not enough to just say, like, in a quick way, this is me, I have this experience too. You have to kind of persuade the person that it's authentic and that it's real, and that you don't have things figured out at the same time. You're not, and then in terms of the way that the overall team operates, so in most of my research projects now, all the coders are people with lived experience. That's a huge part of it. I think you interpret what people are saying differently because you have additional context. Multi-stakeholder coding or multiple perspectives coding can be really valuable too, which Diana Rose in the UK is kind of trying to push, which is you would always have like a clinician, a researcher, and a service user or survivor co-coding the data and working on it. And that's valuable too, because those are different contextual experiential knowledges that are then brought to the interpretation of the material.
You also find that once they've been given a label and then they are rejecting the label, then when they're sitting down with you, they're fearful about sharing about what's going on inside of them, that you'll then say, oh yeah, he is schizophrenic. That label keeps them from sharing about their real issues, because they really need to hide from the world.
Well, yeah, and I think just in general, I mean, interviewing and clinical work and peer support, they're all art. It's all the art of coaxing somebody who's maybe uncomfortable and doesn't want to sort of share their experience, to do so anyway. And, again, people can be better or worse at it, and can be a matter of fit. Some people might never feel comfortable with me in particular as an interviewer and would with somebody else, and there's, limit to what you can do. But, all right, well, anybody who wants to talk to me more, feel free, but thank you all so much for coming.